Business Communication, presented by Matthew Hobbs. The best way to start off this presentation is by defining what is business communication. So in this presentation, I'm going to really highlight the key terms and key things from each section of each week, basically, that really resonated with me and is the biggest takeaways that I've had from each module and each week during my time of taking this course. So, communication is Latin for communicare, which is where it comes from, and this Latin word means to share or to make common. Now, when we look at the definition of communication, which is derived from this Latin word, communication is defined as the process of understanding and sharing meaning. I thought that was obviously a great way to put communication as far as defining it. And also the biggest takeaway specifically for this section for me is looking at the 8 essential components of communication, which are source, message, channel, receiver, feedback, environment, context, and interference. So for the source, I did not know anything about that there was 8 components of communication. I had no idea. This was just made this very clear to me to really break it down into the 8 essential components of what communication is. So the source is the person giving the speech or delivering the words that's being said. The message is the stimulus or meaning produced by the source for the receiver or audience. And the channel is the way in which a message or messages travel between source and receiver. It's basically like a television. That really resonated with me. It just helped. All of this just really helped make everything clear in regards to what communication looks like. And then the receiver is the person who receives the message from the source and analyzes it and interprets the message in ways both intended and unintended by the source. So that really opened my eyes to how you can go about executing proper communication is by knowing your audience and possibly understanding how they're going to interpret the message in the ways you intend them to interpret them and the ways that is unintended for them to interpret the message. And then also feedback is when someone responds to the source intentionally or unintentionally, they are giving the feedback. And then environment, so the environment is the atmosphere. It's physical or psychological where you send and receive messages. The context, which is a big thing to focus on here. The context of communication interaction specifically involves the setting, scene, and expectations of the individuals involved. And this is a specific thing to really focus on and hone in on. This is very overlooked. It's very important to be able to understand the setting, the scene, and what your audience's expectations are when you're addressing those things in order to have professional communication in the correct context in the business world. And then interference, which is the last of these 8 essential components. Interference also is more called noise. It can come from any source. Interference is anything that just blocks or changes the source's intended meaning of the message. So basically, you just want to try to cut out any interference when you're communicating to someone and make sure that your message is as clear as possible. And the biggest takeaway is if I incorporate this in my career and make sure I am taking the steps for the 8 essential components in communication, this will allow me to have the best possible professional communication I can have with my coworkers and my bosses. The next topic we are going to look at is audience purpose and organization. To start off looking at audience, the biggest thing here is addressing the audience's expectations. So we must get to know the audience, and specifically addressing the audience's expectations is the key to one's success in writing and in overall communication. And the way to go about getting the audience's attention and addressing any expectations, a person has to do research and put in the time and effort in order to really understand the audience. And the best way and the biggest takeaway I got from how to resonate with your audience is the example of the iceberg model, which this really hit home for me. When you look at an iceberg on the ocean, normally what you see is what's mainly apparent, which is the top of the iceberg, and that's not the majority of the iceberg. You're just aware of what is on the top of the water. But if you dig a little deeper, and you would do this with your audience as well, if you spend the time and effort to dig a little deeper, you'll see what isn't necessarily readily apparent, which is the majority of the iceberg underneath. And this is just the key to success in regards to addressing the audience, is really getting to know specifically what you might perceive is different ages, races, ethnicities, and genders, but those are specifically like surface characteristics. So the challenge is to dig deeper and figure out, when you're communicating with a diverse audience, if you are engaging the intercultural communication and just making sure that your message is geared specifically to the audience you are addressing. The next topic is purpose. So for purpose, we're going to look at a rhetorical situation, which rarely has one purpose, and the authors and audiences tend to bring their own purposes, and this can often be multiple purposes to each rhetorical situation. And these potentially can conflict or complement each other depending on the author and the audience. So it's important to try to make sure that these purposes are complementing each other and not conflicting each other. So we're going to look at specifically, these are the biggest things for me, is the author's purposes. They can either choose to go about it in a informative way or a persuasive way. So for example, some examples of informative ways are to inform, to describe, to define, to instruct, to advise, to announce, to explain. Those are some examples for how an author can inform the audience. On the other hand, persuasive ways to do it is to persuade, to convince, to influence, to argue, to advocate, to urge, to defend, to justify. Those are a couple of examples on how the author can go about the purpose of their writing and their communication. And then there's also 2 ways that the audience's purposes are. They can either have a more passive purpose or a more active purpose. Some examples of more passive is to receive notice, to feel reassured, to feel a sense of unity, to be entertained, to receive instruction, to enjoy. Some examples for more active purposes are to examine, to quantify, to assess, to make informed decisions, to interpret, to evaluate. So overall, the person speaking and the communicator and the writer in this case needs to make sure that the author's purpose and what they want, specifically looking at this rhetorical situation, needs to match up the audience's purposes. They both have to complement each other and not conflict each other in order to have the best form of communication. The next thing we're going to look at is organization. So the biggest thing for how to organize a paper and writing anything at all is using paragraphs, which paragraphs are the building blocks of papers. And the biggest thing that resonated with me from this section in order to understand how to formulate and form the best possible paragraph for writing is looking at the 5-step process in order to develop an illustration paragraph and in order to understand what should be included in the paragraph. So step 1 in this is to decide on a controlling idea and create a topic sentence. So this idea will direct the paragraph's development as we write this. The step 2 is to elaborate on the controlling idea. So basically just continue to explain what this controlling idea and topic of the paragraph is going to be. Step 3 is to give an example, give multiple examples if possible for the paragraph in order to develop it more and illustrate the claims that are being made in those first 2 steps. And then step 4 is to explain the examples that are given. So you need to elaborate on the examples that are given and explain and break down what it means on the examples that you're giving in your paragraphs. Then step 5 is to complete the paragraph's idea or transition into the next paragraph. So basically for step 5, you need to tie up loose ends or have a transition to move on to the next paragraph that you are going to be writing, and just make sure that you are just wrapping up the best way possible or having a topic to lead to the next topic you are going to discuss in your next paragraph. Writing concisely is one of the biggest struggles that I personally encounter a lot with my writing and how I communicate. I tend to be very wordy. So this section is one of the most important sections and one of the biggest takeaways that I have learned through taking this course is specifically looking at the wordiness in sentences and how to reduce super wordy sentences. So the first step is redundant pairs. So we want to eliminate redundant pairs, and this is just when the first word in a pair has roughly the same meaning as the second one. You just need to choose one. You don't use both. One example of this is for each and every book. You don't need to say for each and every. Just say for every or for each. You just have to pick one, and that'll help lower the words in the sentence. The second one for how to reduce wordiness in sentences is to delete unnecessary qualifiers. Qualifiers aren't necessary to express our meaning. For example, really is a qualifier in this case. And when we delete the unnecessary qualifiers, we can often eliminate 1 or 2 words per sentence, which will over time add up to really diminishing a lot of wordiness. And some of these qualifiers can include actually, really, basically, probably. Those are just a few examples. The next thing is identify and reduce prepositional phrases. So we want to get rid of, which these prepositional phrases tend to start with in, for, at, on, through, and over, and this can often make a sentence unclear. So when writing our drafts and things like that, we should specifically look at all the prepositional phrases and see which ones are not necessary in our writing. And then number 4 is to locate and delete unnecessary modifiers. So sometimes the meaning of a word or phrase will imply its modifier. So the modifier is not necessary since the meaning or whatever phrase is being said will imply what the modifier means as well. So we don't need that. We can take that away. Number 5 is replace a phrase with a word. So this tends to happen when people write professionally, when they say, due to the fact that, in light of the fact that, the reason for, these are often unnecessary and can simply just be replaced by using because, since, or why in order to reduce the wordiness of the sentence when you include that. And then the last thing to look at is to identify any negatives and change them to affirmatives. So when you are trying to write a sentence that is in a negative form, you have to use extra words in order to write that sentence. One example is if you do not have more than 5 years of experience, that is way more words than saying someone with more than 5 years of experience can ... That just makes it way more wordy. So instead of writing things in a negative form, it's better to take that and change it into a positive form. And overall, this is one of the biggest takeaways that I've had from this class, and it has really improved my writing in order to allow me to specifically focus on these 6 ways that I can write more concisely. Moving on to tone. Tone is also a very big topic, major topic that was covered in our class, and really is one of the main things that will determine and potentially eliminate miscommunication in the form of writing. So tone in writing, specifically in writing, refers to the writer's attitude toward the reader and the subject line. The overall tone of a written message can affect the reader just the same as a person's tone of voice can. So the writer should make sure that they're taking proper steps and measures to determine the tone to use, and they should ask 3 questions. So the 3 questions in order to determine the proper and appropriate tone is: why am I writing this document? Who am I writing this document to? And what do I want them to understand? And what kind of tone should I use when writing to that individual? And normally for business writing, there's a pretty similar tone that should be used, and there's one major tone overall that encompasses what an individual should write in the business realm. Specifically, they should always be confident, be courteous and sincere, use appropriate emphasis and subordination, use non-discriminatory language, and stress the benefits for the reader. And the last thing is write an appropriate level of difficulty. For my email interview, I spoke with Elliot Boats, which he is the vice president of sales at Vulcan Materials. And just to cover a little bit about myself, is I have just applied for a sales representative job at Vulcan Materials, and I decided to reach out to the vice president of sales in this area for Vulcan Materials and ask him some questions about what level of business communication is expected, and how much time he spends writing, how much time he spends overseeing and editing documents, how much group communication is involved in his job, and if he has to write or oversee any professional documents. So we set up a little brief back and forward email interview. Because of COVID and everything, he felt more comfortable to just email and cover. I sent him my list of questions and he covered them. And there were some things for the sake of his clients and coworkers' privacy that he couldn't go into a lot of detail about what he sees on the job in order to keep out of respect to his clients and his company. So to address the first thing, how much time he spends writing on a day-to-day basis, normally he will potentially make PowerPoints to talk in a conference and to put together client numbers and to address any type of what he's seeing in regards to the efficiency of sales and where their numbers are at to the president of Vulcan Materials in order to let him know that they are on schedule for their targets of the year. And he summarizes all of that into a professional PowerPoint and that is on the occasion. On a day-to-day basis, he tends to spend 1 to 2 hours of his day reading emails from clients and coworkers of his employees underneath him about any type of issue with the product, which they sell rock to construction companies in order to build roads. So if there's any issues with the level of tonnage and how much rock they're selling and the quantity and quality of the rock, he will read and oversee and edit his employees' emails and read any of the clients' emails in order to address any problems. So for the second one, which is time overseeing and editing documents, he spends 1 to 2 hours a day addressing any concerns and problems and making sure the employees are communicating and writing professionally to their clients in regards to the emails they're sending about Vulcan Materials product. For the next one, for group communication, this is the biggest part of his job as the vice president of sales. He spends majority of his time in board meetings, in meeting with the president of Vulcan Materials. He spends majority of his time meeting with his employees, meeting with his clients to sell and push the product. Everything that he does outside of the office and with upper management in Vulcan Materials is in groups and is heavily focused on group communication with clients and with his employees. And the last one, as far as professional documents, I asked him about if he writes any professional documents or oversees any professional documents, and he does not deal with any professional documents or sees any professional documents in his job. The next topic is business letters. So specifically looking at business letters, the biggest thing that I learned from this is what a business letter is, what it consists of. So the parts of a business letter, the main parts that I have here on the slide is the salutation, body, and closing. But the main thing I learned is how to formulate them. So you should see the sender's address at the top, followed by the date, the inside address, which is the recipient's address, then a salutation, then a body, in order to say your main points in the paragraph, in each paragraph, then a closing statement, which is after the last body paragraph, and then enclosures, which aren't necessary, but if you have any, you can put those in there. Typist initials, and that is everything that groups a business letter. I personally did not know how to write a business letter, but I learned how to formulate and put a business letter together in order to send a business letter to a boss or coworker. Professional emailing is a very important topic to cover, and it can be very overlooked. And personally, from my experience in college, there are several students that tend to email professors unprofessionally. So this is an important topic to really focus on, and making sure that emailing a coworker and a fellow employee, making sure the emailing between those two individuals are at a professional level, especially when transitioning from college, where our professors are a little bit more lenient, to a career where if a person would write an unprofessional email, this could really get them in trouble and potentially jeopardize their job. So to start off looking at the picture here, I typed up a little short email that doesn't really go in depth as far as the body, but we see a professional greeting, which in this case is Dear Dr. Jones. We see a short body to introduce, I hope this email finds you well. And then we also see a sign-off, which is professional, sincerely, Matt Hobbs. We see that signature and my name at the end. To specifically start, we want to look at the components of an email. I could not include this in the picture of the email itself, but we want to include a subject line, which is like the headline, and this should also demonstrate the main point of the message, as in why you are sending that email. Then we want to make sure that we use a greeting, which would be Dear Professor Smith or Dear Dr. Jones, to address them in a professional manner. And we also want to make sure that we are using a professional sign-off as well, which would be thank you, best wishes, sincerely, respectfully yours. Those are some to use. Those first few, thank you, best wishes, are more of a friendly manner. Less formal, more formal would be sincerely, respectfully yours. Those are the main points for conducting an email. And the next topic I have here, the next point is, when is emailing appropriate? So to cover the appropriate times to use email as a form of communication is, for example, when you need to get in touch with a person who is hard to reach over the phone. And some other examples is when you need to send someone an electronic file, such as like a document, a spreadsheet. You might also need to distribute information to a large number of people quickly, which emailing is a great form to use that. The information that you're trying to convey to an individual isn't time sensitive, so they have time to read it. An email would be a great way to do that. And some inappropriate times to use an email in this case is if your message is long and complex and requires additional discussion, so it's very hard to go about emailing. It would be better to accomplish this conversation face-to-face. if the information would be highly confidential, you obviously do not want to email. But overall, emailing is a very good way to get in touch with people and to communicate in a business setting. And this is a major topic that has also helped me in my emails and how I should approach writing them in a professional manner. As for resume and cover letter, I have included my old resume that I submitted for this class on the left here. And the resume should specifically include an objective, your education, work experience, contact information. And if you look up, that summary is my objective. You can see education here, work experience, and the contact information is at the bottom. In order to keep it one page, I put references for available upon request in order to keep that on one page instead of having 2 whole pages of a resume. And the way from your feedback that I've seen is I can write more concisely in my resume and also make sure that my skills section is easier to read. So design that in a new way. But specifically for the resume, the biggest thing to address here is expectations for the resume. So your reader will have expectations about how a resume should look. So the name will typically appear at the top of the resume and is the largest item. That's an example of an expectation. And the readers also expect the information in your resume to be accurate and correct. And the resume should be free of grammatical and spelling errors. So an individual just needs to make sure that they are meeting whoever they're handing their resume to. It needs to meet these expectations in order for them to get hired and get the job. The next thing here is the cover letter, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the main thing that I've learned about a cover letter is it mainly introduces you and your resume, and it can do 3 things. It can explain your experiences in a story-like format. It allows you to potentially go in depth about important experiences and skills to relate them to the job requirements for that job. And it also can show your employer that you are individually writing and tailoring to this specific job application that you are applying for. As for how I'm going to apply what I have learned in this business communication class, I'm going to look at my professional emailing in order to differentiate between when it is appropriate to send an email or when I should try to have a face-to-face conversation. That's one of the biggest things that I've taken away is an appropriate time to send email, as in when I'm trying to get in touch with a group of people versus if there's confidential and privileged information that should not be done over email. As far as writing a professional business letter, just overall the formatting of how a business letter should be laid out is applying that to when I write a business letter. I specifically know how to write that business letter. The next thing is professional communication. The biggest thing that I took away and will apply in my writing and my communication is making sure I use the correct tone and making sure I am concise and get straight to the point, and I'm not very wordy in how I communicate. And as far as writing, I would address any mechanical and grammatical errors that through the feedback of this course has shown me how to structure sentences in a way to make them sound more professional and produce a professional tone and be able to formulate sentences that clearly present my main idea to the audience I am writing to. overall, this class has been very beneficial in improving my communication in the business world. And specifically, this class uses a unique approach to business communication through specifically hands-on learning through the articles we have read, the many articles provided in each module, and also the writing assignments that incorporate and allow us to use the main keys addressed in each week's module in order for us to understand and grasp the topics that are being discussed for that specific week. And also this class provides quality, like I just mentioned, quality resources and many examples of how to approach professional emailing, professional tone, professional overall communication, defining what communication is. This class has made it crystal clear in order for us to understand what those topics are. And overall, this class has improved my business communication in many aspects and has overall improved how I approach starting a professional communication in every aspect in terms of anything that will be thrown at me in a future job. I have been very prepared and made known about any type of business communication I will use in my career.